It was a calm afternoon in May 1943. Off the coast of Virginia, the training carrier USS Charger prepared for another round of carrier qualification flights. On its deck waited a machine that frightened even the bravest pilots, the Vought F4U Corsair. One after another, the fighters approached the ship for landing. From the control tower, officers could see the same pattern unfold every time. The Corsair came in fast, too fast. Its long nose hid the deck completely. The pilot had to guess where the ship was. When the wheels finally hit, the aircraft bounced back into the air, twisted to the right, and slammed down hard. Sometimes it careened into parked planes. Sometimes it went straight over the side. By the end of that month, 11 Corsairs, nearly one every other day, had been wrecked during carrier trials. The Navy called it a disaster. Pilots called it the Widowmaker, a fighter so advanced it was killing its own men before it ever met the enemy. By late October 1943, the order from Washington was final. Corsair grounded for carrier operations. In 1942, the United States had built what should have been the most formidable fighter in the world. The Corsair carried the most powerful piston engine ever fitted to an aircraft, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. Its propeller stretched more than 13 feet, so large that the engineers bent the wings downward and back up again in that unmistakable inverted gull shape, just to keep the blades from slicing the deck. It looked like nothing else in the sky, and on paper, it was perfect. 400 miles an hour, nearly twice the speed of Japan's Zero, able to climb like a rocket and dive like a falling star. The Navy dreamed of a carrier deck filled with Corsairs, sleek, blue, and unstoppable. But the reality was brutal. That same giant engine that made the plane fast also made it vicious to control. The torque pulled the aircraft sideways the instant a pilot touched the throttle. The landing gear, short and stiff, kicked the plane back into the air, and the long nose blocked any view of the carrier until the last second. Landing a Corsair wasn't flying, it was blind faith. One test pilot said, "You don't land it, you survive it." The accidents kept coming. Fire crews raced across decks. Training records filled with the same line. Aircraft bounced, rolled right, struck deck, pilot lost. The Navy grew anxious. Report after report blamed the design. Some commanders suggested scrapping the entire project and returning to the safer, slower Grumman Hellcat. By late 1943, they did exactly that. The Corsair was declared unfit for carriers and shipped off to the Marines, who would have to operate it from rough island airstrips instead. At Vaught's factory in Connecticut, engineers watched their masterpiece being rejected. One later recalled, "We built the fastest fighter on Earth, and they threw it away because it scared them." Crates of unused Corsairs were sent to storage. Others were stripped for parts. The aircraft that should have defined the Pacific War was dying before it ever fought. The name stuck. The Widowmaker. Among young Navy aviators, it became a curse. To fly it was career suicide. To land it on a carrier was unthinkable. For months, the plane sat idle, a dark silhouette against the hangar walls, its engines silent, its promise forgotten. To most of the Navy, the Corsair was finished, a failed experiment in too much power and too little control. But thousands of miles away, across the Pacific, one Marine major was staring at a row of those rejected fighters and seeing something very different. He didn't see a death trap. He saw potential. He saw a weapon waiting for a pilot reckless enough to tame it, and his name was Gregory Boyington. Major Gregory Boyington had never been known for following orders. He'd flown with the American volunteer group in China, the legendary Flying Tigers, and learned early that discipline wasn't his strongest suit. He drank too much, fought too easily, and questioned authority in every uniform he wore. But he could fly, and in the air, he was pure instinct. When he rejoined the Marines in 1942, he wasn't exactly welcomed back. Too old for a fighter pilot, too reckless for command. And yet, when the Navy began offloading its rejected Corsairs to Marine squadrons, Boyington volunteered without hesitation. He didn't care that the aircraft had been branded a killer. He just saw something powerful, raw, and untamed, something like himself. His new unit, VMF 214, would soon earn the name the Black Sheep. It was a collection of pilots pulled together from leftovers, men who'd missed assignments, replacements from other groups, and a few who were simply too wild to fit anywhere else. To the Navy, they were expendable. To Boyington, they were family. Their first Corsairs arrived on a rainy afternoon at Espiritu Santo, blue-grey machines, chipped from transport, streaked with oil. Some still bore carrier markings, ghosts of a service that had rejected them. The Marines didn't care. They were desperate for speed. The Japanese still dominated the skies over the Central Pacific, and every new fighter mattered. The Corsair was not a forgiving teacher. Boyington's pilots learned quickly why the Navy had given up on it. The torque slammed them sideways on takeoff. Visibility during landing was almost zero. The long nose forced them to weave left and right on the taxiway just to see ahead. If the throttle was pulled too suddenly, the plane would flip on its back. Every mission was a gamble, but Boyington believed that if they could survive the plane, they could survive anything the Japanese threw at them. He drilled his men endlessly, not in formation, flying, or radio calls, but in the instincts of combat. He told them, if you can't see the enemy, climb. If you can see him, dive. And never, ever turn with a zero. When the squadron finally went operational in September 1943, the Corsair's reputation was still toxic. Even the ground crews called it the Ensign Eliminator. But on that first patrol over Bougainville, the myth began to crack. A group of Zeros came at them head-on. Fast, tight, and confident, Boyington pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair surged ahead with a roar that shook the cockpit. The Japanese expected a turning fight. Instead, the Marines stayed high, dove once, and climbed out again before the Zeros could react. In seconds, 2 enemy planes were down. The fight was over before the Japanese realized what had happened. For the first time, the Corsair had met its enemy on equal terms, and won. Boyington's tactics were simple but ruthless. Use the power. Use the dive. Never play the Zeros game. The Corsair couldn't turn tighter, but it could run faster, hit harder, and take punishment the Japanese fighters couldn't imagine. When the Marines returned to base, oil leaking from half their engines, the mechanics were waiting with wide eyes. No one had expected them to come back, not in those planes. Over the next weeks, the Black Sheep Squadron carved a reputation out of the sky. Their Corsairs were patched together with spare parts and luck, but they began stacking victories almost daily. Japanese pilots started calling the new blue fighter Whistling Death for the sound its engine made as it dove through the clouds. To them, it was as if the Americans had unleashed something unnatural, a beast that howled before it struck. Back at Navy headquarters, the reports from the Marines caused confusion. The same aircraft they had grounded was now outperforming everything in the Pacific. Boyington's name began to appear in dispatches, first with a few kills, then 10, then 20. The Navy's reject had become the Marine Corps' most feared weapon. Yet even as Boyington and his men turned the Corsair into legend, the Navy still couldn't land it on a carrier. On islands, the long runways forgave its flaws. At sea, they were death sentences. The aircraft still bounced, still rolled, still killed. And as the Marines fought their way north toward Rabaul, one question hung over every briefing room back in Washington. If the Corsair could dominate the air, why couldn't the Navy find a way to make it come home safely? Back in the United States, the reports from the South Pacific were impossible to ignore. Marine Corsairs were claiming kills at a pace no one in Washington had predicted. The same aircraft the Navy had written off as a failure was tearing the Zero apart. In the Bureau of Aeronautics, officers read after-action summaries with disbelief. How were these island-based Marines succeeding with a plane that had nearly been banned? Every graph and memo told the same story. The Corsair dominated the air but still couldn't land on a carrier. The contradiction was humiliating. The Marines had taken the Navy's reject and turned it into a legend. By autumn 1943, pressure was building. Admirals wanted their ships protected by the best fighter available, not the slower Hellcat. If the Marines could make it work from dirt runways, surely the Navy's own pilots could do better. But no one had a solution. Every trial on a carrier ended the same way. A bounce, a roll, another wreck. At NAS Patuxent River and aboard the USS Charger, a handful of test pilots were told to try again. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter, a calm, methodical flyer who'd spent months studying the Corsair's behavior on approach. He didn't think the airplane was cursed. He thought the pilots were using it the wrong way. Porter believed the key was visibility. The Corsair's nose was simply too long for a straight-in landing. If you came in perfectly aligned, you never saw the deck until it was too late. So he tried something that sounded absurd and dangerous. He approached at a slight angle, about 6 degrees off the ship's centerline, slipping the nose just enough to see the deck over the left side of the cowling. To the landing officer, it looked suicidal. One gust of wind, and the plane could clip the island tower. But Porter was steady. He kept the angle, timed the drift, and at the last second straightened out. The Corsair touched down smoothly, hook catching the arresting wire in one clean motion. For the first time in a year, a Corsair had landed on a carrier without disaster. The deck crew erupted, half cheering, half stunned. They had just watched a man disobey every rule in the book and succeed. The next day, Porter repeated it. Then another pilot tried, and another. Each time, the results held. The trick worked because it solved the one thing no engineer could. It gave the pilot his eyes back. Engineers soon added a small metal strip, a stall strip, on the right wing's leading edge to force both sides to stall evenly, eliminating the deadly roll. Together, Porter's angled approach and the stall strip modification turned the Corsair from a monster into a manageable machine. The Navy's embarrassment shifted to relief. After months of frustration and bad press, they finally had an answer. By early 1944, carrier trials resumed. The same airplane, once branded a Widowmaker, was touching down on the decks of the USS Essex and Bunker Hill with precision and confidence. Training manuals were rewritten to teach the curved approach, a maneuver that every Corsair pilot would soon memorize. Turn 6 degrees, trust your sightline, and fly it down. And as those first carrier landings succeeded, something changed inside the Navy. The fear that had haunted the Corsair for 2 years began to fade. The fighter that once symbolized failure was finally coming home to the ships it was built for, and just in time for the next stage of the Pacific War. The idea spread quietly at first. A few test pilots at Patuxent River whispered about the man who'd landed the Corsair sideways. In the ready rooms, they called it Porter's suicide turn. No one was sure whether to admire him or to question his sanity. But when the Navy reviewed the flight logs, the results were undeniable. His landings were smooth, no bounce, no roll, no broken gear. For a plane once feared as uncontrollable, within weeks, the Bureau of Aeronautics ordered every test pilot to study the new approach. They called it the curved landing pattern. Instead of descending straight toward the ship, a Corsair would circle in from the left, keeping the deck in sight the entire time. At the last second, the pilot would roll out of the turn, line up with the arresting wires, and drop onto the deck in one fluid motion. It looked reckless from the tower, a plane slipping in at an angle, then snapping straight just before touchdown. But it worked. The trick gave pilots their vision back. For the first time, they could actually see where they were landing. What had seemed suicidal became second nature. Porter and his team repeated the test dozens of times. Different ships, different wind conditions, different loads. Each time, the Corsair handled it. The fatal right-wing stall was gone. Balanced by that small strip of metal engineers had bolted to the wing's leading edge. In the test reports, one line kept appearing. Aircraft behavior. Satisfactory. That phrase meant everything. After nearly 2 years of fear and embarrassment, the Navy finally had its carrier fighter back. By the spring of 1944, flight instructors at Glenview and Jacksonville were teaching new pilots the technique as standard procedure. Manuals were updated with simple sketches. A 6-degree offset, a gentle turn, a final flare. Underneath, in bold print, the rule every Corsair pilot would memorize. Turn to see the deck, or you'll never see it at all. The change rippled through the fleet. On the decks of the USS Bunker Hill, Essex, and Yorktown, the Corsair began to appear again. Deep blue, wings folded, engines rumbling. You could hear their arrival before you saw them. That distinct whistle of air through the wing root. The sound that Japanese pilots would soon fear. What had started as one man's dangerous experiment now stood as official Navy doctrine. Instructors joked that the Corsair was still trying to kill you, just less often. But confidence returned. Carrier groups finally had the fighter they'd been promised 2 years earlier, fast, rugged, and deadly. And in the Pacific, where Boyington's Black Sheep still fought from rough island strips, the news meant something more. It meant the plane they had kept alive was coming home to the carriers. The same aircraft that once burned on the decks of training ships was now landing in perfect rhythm, hooks clattering across the wires, engines cooling in victory. The suicidal landing trick had saved not only the Corsair, but the pride of naval aviation itself, though no one yet realized how far this blue-winged monster was about to go. By early 1944, the Corsair was ready to return to the carrier decks it had once been banished from. The new landing technique had spread across the fleet like quiet redemption. Every pilot now trained with the curved approach, a 6-degree offset that turned fear into muscle memory. And with each successful landing, the stigma that had haunted the F4U began to fade. When the USS Bunker Hill launched its first Corsair combat patrol, The ship's crew gathered on deck to watch. They had seen too many crashes in the past. This time, the fighters lifted cleanly into the air, their engines thundering with the deep growl of the R-2800. The men who'd once called it the Widowmaker started to call it something else, the Whistling Death. In the Pacific, that name would soon become literal. The Corsair's gull-wing design produced a sharp whistle as air rushed through the intakes during a dive. Japanese pilots learned to recognize the sound seconds before their aircraft exploded. The first carrier-based missions came in the spring of 1944 as Task Force 58 struck the Marshall Islands and Truk Lagoon. Corsairs flew escort for bombers, hunted Zeros, and swept enemy bases ahead of the landings. The results were staggering. The kill ratio climbed past 10-1, the highest of any American fighter in the Pacific. Even veteran Japanese aces found themselves outclimbed, outdived, and outgunned. The Corsair's massive engine gave it the edge in every vertical fight. It could dive away from danger, then claw back up to altitude before the enemy recovered. Its 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns shredded the thin-skinned Zeros with a single burst. And when it took damage, the Corsair simply kept flying, its thick armor and air-cooled engine refusing to die. For the Navy, it was vindication. For the Marines, it was proof of what they had known all along. Boyington's rejected airplane had now become the standard of naval aviation. Carrier decks, once ruled by Hellcats, were filling with the deep blue silhouettes of Corsairs, folded wings glinting under the Pacific sun. Boyington himself wouldn't see the transformation. In January 1944, he was shot down near Rabaul and captured. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Japan, unaware that the plane he had championed was now rewriting history. His Black Sheep Squadron continued flying without him, their Corsairs growing more refined with each new model, F4U 1D, then F4U 4, faster, steadier, more lethal. By the time the carriers pushed toward the Philippines, the Corsair had fully earned its place. Night fighter versions hunted bombers over Okinawa. Marine squadrons used it for close air support, hammering Japanese strongholds with rockets and napalm. From a design that once couldn't land on a ship, it had become one of the most versatile combat aircraft of the entire war. Engineers back home followed every report. Vaught's design team, who had once watched their creation grounded, now received letters from carrier groups thanking them for the fastest damn plane ever built. Production lines expanded. The Corsair was no longer an experiment. It was the face of victory. By late 1944, as the Allies closed in on Japan, Corsairs filled the skies from the Marianas to the South China Sea. They escorted bombers over Truk, strafed shipping in the Philippines, and dueled the last desperate Japanese fighters over Iwo Jima. For every Zero that rose to meet them, 10 never came back. And yet, the story of the Corsair was still changing. Its brutal power, once feared, had become its strength. Its flaws had become lessons printed in every Navy flight manual. It was no longer the Widowmaker. It was the proof that sometimes the only way to fix a monster is to learn how to live with it. When the war finally ended, the Corsair was still flying. The same aircraft that had terrified its first pilots in 1943 was now the veteran of every major Pacific campaign. It had outlived the Zero, the Ki-43, and even the Hellcat that once replaced it. On carrier decks across the fleet, rows of blue-grey Corsairs folded their wings for the last time, their paint scarred, their engines scorched, their fuselages patched with years of war. In the months after Japan's surrender, the Navy and Marine Corps reviewed every combat record. One figure stood out. The Corsair had achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American fighter in World War II, better than 11-1. What had begun as an experiment in too much power had become a textbook in how to master it. For Sam Porter, the quiet test pilot who had risked his life to land a Corsair sideways, there were no parades. His curved approach landing simply became standard doctrine, absorbed into every flight manual as if it had always been there. He went back to testing other aircraft, watching newer jets replace the machines he had once tamed. But the 6-degree turn he pioneered lived on, carried unconsciously by generations of Navy pilots who would never know his name. Gregory Boyington came home thin, unshaven, and stubborn as ever after 20 months in captivity. He learned that the airplane he had defended, the one the Navy had called a death trap, was now the backbone of American carrier aviation. The Marine Corps credited him with 22 victories and awarded him the Medal of Honor. He laughed when reporters asked about the Corsair's reputation. "It wasn't the plane that tried to kill us," he said. "It just wanted to see who was serious about flying it." The Corsair's story didn't end with the surrender. It fought again in Korea, strafing columns of tanks and surviving hits that would have downed any jet of the time. It flew from carriers in the cold seas off Wonsan, its engine's deep thunder echoing across a new generation's war. By the time it retired in the mid-1950s, the Corsair had become the longest-serving piston fighter in American history. For the men who had flown it, the plane remained more than steel and rivets. It was a reminder that the line between genius and madness in aviation was always thin. Every curve of its wings, every ounce of torque, every terrifying landing approach was a lesson written in risk and paid for in courage. The Navy never again forgot that lesson. Every carrier fighter that followed, from the Panther to the Phantom, owed something to that suicidal idea from 1943. That small offset angle, that insistence on visibility and control, became part of the DNA of naval aviation. And though the Corsair would eventually give way to jets, its legend only grew. In museums and airshows decades later, the old gull-wing fighter still carried the same whistle as it dove past the crowd, still the same sound that once froze Japanese pilots in fear. To most who heard it, it was history. To those who remembered, it was a heartbeat, the echo of a machine that refused to be forgotten.